Now, the issue of oil revenue transparency and accountability in several countries in sub-Saharan Africa came under the spotlight at a recent gathering of executives, industry leaders in London. Our correspondent Carina Kamel followed up.
Oil industry experts from around the world gathered in London this week to discuss ways to better manage Africa's oil resources. Participants at the conference examined the findings of projects in oil-rich countries like Nigeria and Angola, where the goal was to increase transparency and encourage people to hold their governments to account. For more, I'm joined by Paloma Sid from the London-based oil consultancy CWC Group. I'm also joined by Patrick Raleigh, economist and editor at the Economist Intelligence Unit, EIU. Thank you both so much for coming into the studio today. Patrick, let me start with you. Just briefly tell us about this project. I presume it's some kind of a pilot project, really, in these three countries that were selected: Nigeria, Angola, already very big oil producers in Africa, and Sao Tome, an up-and-coming oil producer.
That's right, yeah. I mean, really, there's a number of projects which are going and looking at these countries about how civil society groups can hold their governments to account about the oil sector, which is, of course, a major contributor to these countries' economies, the major contributor in many cases. We looked in the first session about Sao Tome, which is perhaps going to be the next big story in oil. There's a lot of excited talk that there's maybe 10 billion barrels of oil off the coast of Sao Tome. That could make it a fairly major producer. It could be the new Kuwait, but there's major problems ahead there. They've already held licensing rounds there with big problems. A lot of people thought corruption might have been involved there, and they sold the licensing blocks to companies too cheaply. So big question marks.
Just to follow up on that, with this project that was executed there, clearly, I guess, presumably what you're saying means the findings said that the country isn't really ready to manage its resources, or doesn't have the infrastructure in place to manage its resources in an effective way, in a transparent, accountable way. Is that what you're saying? And if so, what can they do? What can they do?
Well, there's various groups are working on this. You've got groups like the EITI, the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative. And this is a large initiative. It's been backed by the UK and Norwegian governments. It's got oil companies on board, and crucially, it's got African governments on board and civil society. So EITI sadly had to kick out Sao Tome from the process. It was the only other country, along with Equatorial Guinea, to be expelled. This was basically because they hadn't made the progress in, producing accounts, giving the data, being transparent, exactly the kind of thing they needed.
Do you think it's a lack of will, or do you think it's because they're not really sure how to go about doing it?
I think it's more a lack of capacity, essentially. This is the problem here. It's a country of 160,000 people, poverty levels very high, education levels very low. So in this instance, it's going to be hard to find people who have the skills to negotiate a good oil deal for the country.
I want to come back to this issue. It sounds like Sao Tome is a really good, let's say, examining ground for how, what to do right, what to do wrong. But Paloma, let me ask you about Nigeria specifically. I mean, if anything, Nigeria and Angola are the perfect example of oil-rich countries where that wealth hasn't really benefited the people in the way it should, to the degree that it should. Now, Nigeria is unique as well because it's not only the lack of management, it's not only damaging the people or not benefiting the people as much as it could, but actually the country itself isn't producing as much oil as it could. So it's sort of like a lose-lose situation here. From your experience, what needs to change there?
Well, I mean, in Nigeria, there are capacity issues, but Nigeria is more than capable of managing its resources.
So they have the capacity, they have the will, they're not like Sao Tome.
Yeah,
so what's wrong?
They have the talent, they have the education. Right. The problem there is, I think, is what they need is what we all need, a change in consciousness. Look at the big picture and look at the long term. Think about the future generations, not about the here and now and how can I get rich. And then the government, within the government, within the oil companies, despite the bad reputation they have, they're very honest people who are really looking out, wanting to do the best for the country. Now there are very powerful people wanting to protect their own interests.
Within the government?
Well, they've got they're everywhere. They've got their tentacles spread around, and there's also the mentality of everybody. There was a very interesting findings from a survey that were discussed in the conference, and it showed a huge lack of interest from the civil society in the management of oil revenues.
Why do you think that is?
Well, because they don't feel like that. Yeah, the civil society don't feel that the wealth belongs to them.
So they're not engaged in the process.
Exactly, they're not engaged. They think, well, the government manages this. They should know what to do with it. They don't feel like they should be involved.
So let me ask you about Angola. I mean, this is a shocking statistic. Angola is about to overtake Nigeria, I think, as one of the largest oil producers in Africa, and yet it has the highest infant mortality rate in the world. I mean, how is this possible?
Well, because again, the wealth is not equally, you know.
How do you fix this?
How do you fix this? Oh, there are many ways. I mean, there's a problem of corruption. There's a problem of secrecy. Again, powerful people with interests that they're protecting, lack of vision for the future, for the big picture.
Yeah.
They don't see that, you know, what is best for the country will be best for them in the future.
Yeah. In fairness, just to point out, obviously Nigeria is currently in the process of debating in Parliament the Petroleum Industries Bill. Now, just briefly and finally from you, what do you expect? They said that it's very important that they get this done before August because otherwise it's going to go into elections in 2011.
Right.
How optimistic are you that this will actually be resolved?
Well, I'm hopeful and optimistic. There is a, you know, from the statements that the president's been making and the Minister of Petroleum, there is a very strong will to pass this this legislation, which will have a huge impact in the NNPC as well, in oil revenues. The fiscal terms are a big sticking point, as we know. So yeah, I'm hopeful and optimistic, but you never know. You know, there's never a dull moment.
Let me just end with you, Patrick. These kinds of groupings, I mean, the list of people attending this conference is vast, and everybody seems to be very well equipped to give very good advice, very good recommendations. Paloma was talking about corruption, and she was talking about a disengagement on the part of civil society. These are not things that are going to be solved by conferences taking place in London. How do you transfer what's happening here, the knowledge, the expertise, the desire to help, to actually change on the ground in Africa?
Yeah, absolutely right. A lot of it's got to come from within the country, from with civil society groups there on the ground. But that's not to say there isn't a role for people out here in London and New York and Switzerland, because of course a lot of these oil companies are based in the West, and so it's up to the Western governments to hold them to account. The US is doing this currently. New legislation coming through from the SEC. Any oil company listed there has to give a list of all the payments it makes to governments. So that's information in the public domain. People on the ground in Africa can use this information. They can say to the government, we know that Exxon or Shell or whoever gave you the X many $1 million. What have you done with this money? And so it's a two-pronged strategy here, really. You've got to build up civil society in the countries, but you've also got to increase transparency. And for that, you need international will.
Fantastic. And the founder of Transparency International actually wrote an open letter about that very subject, praising the U.S. legislation that you mentioned, which requires companies operating in the oil industry to be more transparent about who they're giving money to and who they're getting money from. A really, really interesting topic. Thank you both so much for joining us in our London studio.